All right, here's the fun part. We are going to talk about what this actually means. So I'm using Johnston & Kyer, page 54, as a reference here. This MSV, this meaning, structure, and visuals, relates to the MSV here. Okay, so Clay uses the same MSV. You need to understand this page in order to do it. So let's talk for a second. Basically, readers use these three cueing systems to read. We either use meaning from the picture, the sentence, the story to figure out what's going on, or we use structure, where we think about what sounds right, knowledge of spoken language. We'll come back to this. Or they use visuals. Visuals are the letters, the phonics, the things that are on the page. Some students get very confused because pictures are giving us meaning. They're not visuals. Pictures tell you what's going on. This picture tells me that Elephant is sad and Piggy is concerned. The visuals on the page are this V is actually just the phonics, okay? The structure, for example, here, it would never say my friend are sad because this is singular, so this has to be singular. That's the kind of structure that they're talking about, what sounds right, drawing upon your knowledge of spoken language. So, moving on from that idea, I wrote down MSV next to every error and self-correction that this kid had, okay? So if you had multiple errors on a page, you're going to have to write MSV twice or something here. It turned out that he didn't do that, but many kids will. You'll have multiple errors and you just have to write it kind of small. It doesn't matter. This is for you. Okay? So, and then what I'm going to do is go through each error and ask myself what influenced his reading. Okay? So what I'm going to circle are things that he did use, okay? Not what he didn't use, what he did use, okay? So when I go to this self-correction, very beginning of this page, and sometimes you're not going to know, right? But right away, Asher said who, and then he self-corrected to oh. Now, I'm thinking that he must have used visuals, and that might be it, because there's not a lot going on here for him to know. You can say who on its own. It would probably have a question mark, so you could argue that that's maybe structure. But I'm going to guess that he used visuals because he said who, and then he realized, although WHO does have some of the same letters, maybe it was in the other direction. So I'm going to go like this. Now, it's arguable, right? You could say that he used something else. That's okay, because we're trying to get a big picture here. It's not about the one thing. All right, and now we're moving on to his next one. He said, here. He said, I cowboy instead of a cowboy. So in my head right away, he was not using structure, right? Because we don't say I cowboy. That doesn't make sense. I don't think he was using meaning either, because I cowboy doesn't make any sense in terms of meaning. I'm sorry, earlier when I said make sense, I meant in terms of language. So I think that he was only using visuals. Now, that doesn't look like visuals, right? It doesn't look like an I, but the only other word that he probably knows that's a single letter, that's a capital often, is the word I. And I'm guessing that that's what he was doing here. Okay, so that's just my sense of it. You could argue that it's the other way around. So again, this is the same one. He said I instead of a, same idea, visuals. Okay, let's move on to his next error. It's on this page where he said only instead of anyone. So this is where it'd be good to write in page numbers, and I'm really bad about that. I wish I had done it. So it looks like right here. So the text says, how can anyone be sad around a robot? And he said, how can I think he said yellow or something. I can't remember why I wrote that. Oh, and then he says only. So you need to read it as he left it. How can only? Now, does that make any sense? How can only in terms of meaning? How can only? Probably not. So I don't think he was using meaning. I'm going to cover up the rest of this because it gets confusing. Could he have said, how can only in the English language? Does that make sense? No, not really. Now, how can only? When I think about the way the word only looks, it has an O and it has an N and it has a Y. So it's not exactly close, but I'm guessing, again, he was just sounding it out and he was using visuals. Let's look at the next one. How can anyone be sad around a robot? How can only be so around, he eventually got that one, a robot, and he got it. So how can only be so around a robot? And again, I'm thinking that doesn't really make sense. How can only be so? How can only be so? We could say be so, like, you know, how could you be so angry, or how could you be so, something like that. So be so actually does work structurally, but it's a little confusing, but I did circle that, the S. And then I think visually, because it just starts with an S and it's a short word, I think that that's probably what he was doing. Okay, next one. It says, I am sorry. And he ends up saying waited to make you happy. This is a perfect example of something where he was probably using all three. Does it make sense to say I waited? Yes. Does it sound like English to say I waited? Yes. Does it look like the same word? Yeah, it's all but one letter. So he was using all three of the cueing systems. He just happened to pick the wrong word. That's a really great kind of error. When the kid is really using everything, it just happens to not work out. We want to see those kind of things. All right, moving forward. When he says pig instead of piggy, that's basically the same idea, right? It still makes sense. It's structurally sound. Now here's where I'm going to say he was using visuals, but he wasn't using them enough, right? Because if he had, he would notice that it was a longer word. So I think he was using visuals, but I'm going to say actually he wasn't using them enough, and I'm not going to circle it there. That you could argue that he was, though. All right, this weren't not. This is a confusing one. So on the page, it says, I went too far, sorry. So it says, but you were not there to see him. After he struggled a little bit, he ended up saying, but you weren't not there to see him. Meaning-wise, sure, they're both negatives. Here's one where he was not using structure. We don't do a double negative and say weren't not. So he was not using structure. I would say he was using visuals because I think he saw those words and he was just getting a little bit messed up in them. So that one he used meaning and visuals, but not structure. All right, the next one. The will. I think I passed it too far. Hold on. Oh, here. It says, he said, will, in fact, I. So this is a tricky one, right? I don't think he was saying will as in a name, which could make sense if you said will, and then you were addressing a person named Will. I think he just read the wrong word. So in terms of meaning, will does not go like that. Structurally, will, comma, in fact, I, it doesn't really work. But visually, I would say he was probably using visuals and he just saw the word will. Okay? And that's where I stopped with him in this book. So I'm going to look at all these errors, and I mean, right away I noticed he uses visuals a lot, right? That's his kind of go-to. He's got visuals in tons of them, but you can count them up. So he used V, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 out of his 8 errors, he was using visuals. Sorry, I'm writing using visuals. Terrible photography. Sorry about that. All right, the next one. I'm going to count up meaning. Well, he's not using meaning here. He's got it 1, 2, 3 times. Okay, so he used meaning 3 out of 8 times. Structure, none there. 1, 2, 3 times again. So when I think about him just as a very preliminary analysis, his go-to method for solving a word is visuals. He uses meaning and he uses structure, but he uses visuals a lot more. This is really common in schools today because so many kids just learn phonics, right? The very first go-to thing is always sound it out, and that's a phonics thing. So I'm not surprised at all. I think you'll end up finding this too. But what I want you to do after you've done this is go back to this chapter and try to make sense of what this means to you as his teacher, and then try to figure out what you're going to do with him based on that. So here she talks about prompting readers. Okay, this is, again, all about MSV. So I want you to reread this chapter because it's really going to help you a lot more after you've done this. But right away, when I'm working with Asher moving forward, I'm not going to say sound it out because he already sounds it out. He knows how to do that. I'm going to use these things. He needs to use more M and more S. Does it make sense? Does it sound right? Does it look right? Okay, so I'm going to try to remember for myself, when he's struggling with a word, I need to prompt him by saying, does it make sense? Does it sound right? Okay, so when he got to this I, cowboy, if I would have been teaching him, which I wasn't, I was trying to take this running record. If I would have been teaching him, I would have said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Does that make sense to say I, cowboy? And I would have covered it up in the book because he doesn't need to look at the letter for that one. He needs to think, does that make sense? Okay, so when you're doing your write-up for your reading profile, this is what you're taking. You're taking this information, you're using this stuff in the book, and you're making sense of it and trying to understand what kind of reader this kid is and what you would teach them as their teacher. All right, let me know if you have questions.